Alright, this is gonna be new for me. So usually I make very like bombastic videos. Oh my goodness. But yesterday someone entered my Discord and they were like, hey, you really praised the Maroczy Bind, but I don't know what I'm doing. So I gave a bit of a lecture and like some people joined in and it was very fun. But I thought it would be fun to go over some like really strong Grandmaster games. That's usually how I learn openings. White pieces, we have Botvinnik versus someone named Lombardy. And the game started with an English, c4, c5. The symmetrical English is probably one of the most principled variations against c4. The other two being either e5 or knight f6. And here's the move knight f3, pawn g6. And Botvinnik is very well known for something called the Botvinnik setup in the English, which is when you play the move pawn to e4. Now this isn't quite a Botvinnik setup, but the idea is very normal. And here once black goes bishop g7, we actually end up in a Sicilian dragon after the move pawn d4. Sort of to show you how that goes after the move e5, c5, knight f3, g6. Here we get a Sicilian dragon with pawn c4. Now compare this position to what we end up with in the game after d4 takes and takes, and you'll see it's just exactly the same position. So black plays the move knight to c6. There's of course tension on the knight now. It's only defended once, so we defend it with bishop e3. Knight goes to f6. Simply we're hitting the pawn, so we need to defend. And here black decides to castle. Quick little side note. In this position, of course, knight g5 is impossible because the queen controls that square. But if we end up in a situation where knight g4 can be played, that is really beneficial for black. Since we essentially target this bishop, there's pressure on the knight. So in the event that knight g4 is possible, you want to be able to meet that with bishop to e2, just so that you further control this square. There will be times when like sort of these moves are played. Now the move bishop e3 would be a mistake since it allows the knight to go to g4. If the knight can come to g4, you want to be able to meet that with bishop to e2. After that, you should normally reach this sort of position, d6 and castles. So this is sort of the starting position for the Maroczy Bind. One of the reasons why the Maroczy Bind is better in the Sicilian dragon compared to other Sicilians is because black has a harder time setting up in the hedgehog formation, where usually you don't want to fianchetto this bishop. If black gets a scenario where this bishop does end up on the long diagonal, very often you want to then play a move like pawn to f3, just to blunt the bishop somewhat. If that isn't the case, and it's also not very likely to happen here, you don't want to commit the f-pawn too quickly, since if you go f3, sometimes you want to push the pawn to f4. And in those scenarios, f3 would simply be a loss of tempo. Also worth noting about a pawn to f3 is that it really limits in this bishop. The line square bishop in the Maroczy Bind formation is already quite passive, and f3 really cements that in. That being said, as is demonstrated in this game, this bishop, despite being passive for a long time, can become quite active in the future. Sometimes simply because it indirectly prevents a pawn break on b5, but other times there are ideas of breaking with f4, f5, or f4, e5, or even with c5. However, with all of these ideas, you have to be patient. You have a space advantage, so you have the time to maneuver your pieces around. Generally, you just kind of let this bishop be, because it's kind of annoying for black, because it cements further control of b5. And then at your own convenience, you will at some point open up the position. Here, Botvinnik played queen to d2, just simply connecting the rooks. Here, black decides to exchange. Now, quick little note, white has a space advantage, so principally that would tell you that trading down material would be good for the black pieces. If you gain nothing from it, you shouldn't trade. That does indeed negate your space advantage. You shouldn't be scared to trade either, since very often we want to drag some sort of advantage into the endgame. So yes, we have a space advantage. That means we shouldn't trade for no reason. But if we think a trade benefits us, we shouldn't dodge it just because we have an advantage in space. Now, I feel like I wasn't super clear about this in the video. You do have to be careful when going into an endgame in these positions. Not only because your space advantage isn't as strong when there are less pieces on the board, it's also because you are in a large number of endgames overextending. Not only that, but you also have a lot of weakened squares, namely d4. Finally, there's some scenarios where you can find yourself in a bad bishop versus like good knight endgame. So while it's fine to go into an endgame, before we do so, we want to transform the structure in some way. Okay, black here played the move queen a5. And here I'll pose you a little question. Where do white's rooks belong? So we have two rooks, so try and name two squares. The rooks really belong on the files that are most likely to open up. Like for example, the e file isn't really that likely to open. There are some scenarios where this rook does go to e1. If you put your rooks on both d1 and c1, which you know are the files that are most likely to open, since in this scenario they already have open files, you're almost always correct. Lombardy played rook c8, which is very normal. We have to have open c files, so we want to get some counterplay there. And here Botvinnik goes for a little combination with bishop f6. Like I said, I went through this in my Discord and I asked the people there, why did Botvinnik play bishop f6? Because I told them, like, it seems really counterproductive. Why are we giving up our dark square bishop for a knight? And I heard some people give me reasons like, oh, this knight is really strong and has targets and this bishop doesn't. That is pretty nonsensical. Oh, it has so many strong targets on e4, but I like play f3 and like the knight doesn't have have a target anymore. So that would be really strange reasoning. This bishop is really good. It's sort of destiny is very likely to trade against the dark square bishop. But right now we have a really well-placed piece, and this knight isn't really doing a whole lot. Why do we trade off our dark square bishop for the knight? Well, it gets very concrete, and that's the thing about chess. You can sit here and talk about opening principles all you want. At the end of the day, like, reasoning and lines are always concrete. So it's really hard to take general principles from decisions like this. Bishop f6, if you play it in your games, is almost always a bad decision, but here it works. Mostly because of the tension between the queens. After bishop takes back, we have to move knight d5. But after queen d2, here it looks like we take, and what have we really accomplished here? So now here you find... Now here you need to find an in-between move. Simply knight takes f6. Now what would you do here with the black pieces? And I would recommend you to find a creative move. So the move here played was king g7, which looks really clever. You wouldn't want to take with the pawn, since after we take back, we're simply going to double up. And we have a really clear target here on d6. And this is just losing. We have no weaknesses and black has a lot. But black here found a really creative move with king g7. Just simply arguing that, like, you're gonna take my queen and I'm gonna take the knight back, keeping my pawn structures good. Botvinnik probably saw this and he saw one move further. Here white has the move knight h5. We just try and get some form of advantage. In this case, we get a slightly damaged pawn structure. So while the position is quite holdable, as you would see by the engine, white simply has a way easier game. I don't think you can do the same thing here with king h6. The knight is simply protected by the bishop. So after we take the queen, they're still gonna have to take with the pawn. So we take back. Here black played the move pawn to f6. There's some sort of x-ray on the d-file. So if black does nothing, there may be some threat of e5, either immediately or in the future, where we can't take because the bishop would be hanging. So f6 simply strengthens control of the e5 square. Okay, white played the move pawn to b3. This is just an improving move you can sort of always play in these Maroczy Bind variations, especially if there's no bishop on the long diagonal. Now I want to quickly go over the topic of good and bad bishops. So first of all, if we compare these bishops over here, a lot of people will tell you that, like, oh, well, black has the good bishop and white has the bad bishop. More relevant to this position in particular, in the Maroczy Bind variation, the light square bishop is actually a pretty good asset for white, since it fights against two of the most common pawn breaks. And this is something you gotta keep in mind in almost every position. Black has two main pawn breaks to unbind themselves. One of them is d5. Now it's very clear that d5 is really hard to get in this position. The other one being b5. And as you can probably imagine, if this bishop gets traded, then a6 b5 might be a more serious plan. So even though this bishop is technically locked behind these pawns, it's very often a pretty good asset just to keep black's other pieces immobile. That's a pretty common theme, like the bad quote-unquote bishop defends strong pawns. In this position, the pawn on h5 is hanging, and black here plays a move rook to c5, simply defending it. Now don't be tempted by moves like pawn b4, being like, oh, I'll kick the rook away and then I'll take the pawn on h5. Well, in this scenario, we've taken the pawn here, but we've dropped the defender of c4, so rook simply takes. And it's pretty simple to see that we don't want to trade the c4 pawn for the h5 pawn. This pawn is a weakness, and this pawn is really good in preventing black from freeing their position. Here Botvinnik played a really high-class move, pawn f4. This move does a lot. So I would recommend you pause and kind of try and list the reasons for yourself why this move is so strong. Couple reasons. First of all, there is some future scenario where we play the move f5 to dislodge the defense of h5. This is in some regards slightly counter-positional. We sort of weaken our square control and we put in more pawns on knight squares. But like I said, if we very concretely can win a pawn, then it's obviously alright. But that's more of a future idea. Also, it's worth noting that it just simply controls squares that this rook can go to, right? We're controlling all of these squares over here. But more importantly, and I think this is really the sort of strongest point of these moves, like they're really multifunctional. If we try and evaluate this position, and we're in an endgame, we can look at three things. We can look at pawn structure. Well, it's very clear that white has the better pawn structure. We can also look at piece activity, and we can look at activity of the king. When looking at king activity, you need to sort of be able to schematically go through a position. Where is the square where these kings want to go? You want your king to be on the dark square, because there are light square bishops on the board. And you want your king to be centralized. Now for white, that is quite simple. This white king has two pretty good dark central squares, either e3 or d4. However, for black, it's a lot harder. This king can't really go anywhere. So f4 simply prepares for the king to walk into the middle. Now, like I said, you also need to compare piece activity. You will be able to see pretty soon that the rooks really benefit from the space advantage that white has. Okay, the game continues with rook a to c8. A very thematic pawn break is the move b5. And you can see the e-file shooting up. b5 is a losing move, and I need you to find why. Because if we simply trade everything and we play something like rook c1, yes, we get the sort of open file, but this really isn't as big of an advantage. So what did Botvinnik have in mind against b5? Well, the move is pawn to b4, and now we just win material. So it's sort of important to keep this things in mind. b5 never really works in this game, but both b5 and d5 are sort of pawn breaks that when they work, black can very quickly equalize. Okay, so rook c8 was played instead. If you need to come up with a plan in chess, we have some static advantages. In chess, we sometimes refer to dynamic versus static advantages. A dynamic advantage is something that dissipates over time. Like if you look at games like Paul Morphy, he will get an advantage like a lead in development or an attack on an uncastled king. And it's kind of obvious that if you do nothing, that advantage goes away. So then you need to be quick. Botvinnik has accumulated a lot of static advantages. An advantage in space is not something that goes away in a couple moves. A weakened pawn structure is also not something that goes away quickly. So when you have some static advantages, there are a lot of plans that are good. Here, Botvinnik could play moves like king f2, king e3, and then do something else. That would have been a completely fine plan as well. However, a very easy way to find a good plan in chess, especially if it's a slower position, is by asking yourself what piece is currently doing nothing. This rook on a1 is doing nothing. Well, here Botvinnik played the move rook to e1. We have a space advantage, and in this sense, we can use that to lift the rook over, where it can either go to h3 if this bishop were to move, or to the g3 square, where it stands nice and active. Someone in my Discord came up with the move rook c1. This fails tactically. There's now a pin on the c file. I'm pretty sure we can now play a move like b5. So you always need to be careful of pinning yourself. Someone suggested the move rook f1, which seems to do this sort of rook lift quicker. I'm not entirely sure, but I think now there's just bishop g4. And ideally, you'd want to drop the bishop back to f1. And we don't want to trade off the light square bishops. We fix black's pawn structure, but also now b5 might be easier to get in. When black gets to break open the position, they've equalized. So in that sense, rook e1 is a lot more normal, where if bishop g4 happens, we can just drop back to f1. Someone did ask me, is there something wrong with bishop d3? I think the answer is no. It's slightly more in the way. I would just say that bishop f1 is just less in the way of our pieces. When you have a space advantage, patience is key. You don't have to rush with things. Black here played the move bishop e8, which is a multi-purpose move for getting out of this pin, and we're defending h5. Botvinnik is not really hurrying. He just plays bishop f1, and now we're just preparing to lift the rook over. The bishop goes to f7, and Botvinnik first brings the king to f2. These world champions, they had like a really good sense for harmonious piece placement. White is just very calmly improving the position further and further with a lot of patience. While black, because they're so cramped and because they have these weaknesses they always need to guard, is just really like struggling to get anything going. So black here played the move pawn a6, which is always a useful move. Sometimes we prepare b5. Rook e3. If you see a job like lifting the rook over that can be done by two pieces, always pick the piece that's doing the least at the moment. Okay, rook a5. Now we're attacking this pawn. It's not an immediate threat, but we play a4 anyway. This pawn structure here isn't really that soft, and we are binding b5 even further. Here Lombardy played rook c5, just going back. Like I said, black is really struggling for a plan. The bishop goes back to e2. You know, it does stand better here than it does on f1. Now rook g3 check. The king goes to f8. Well, now that we first tickled the king one square away, we go to h3. And this is really the high class. Like if you compare going to h3 immediately, here the king still stands closer to defending the weakness compared to when we give the check first. So that really just shows class. Also, one fun little note about king h6 is that there are some scenarios where this pawn can be pinned because it stands on the same file as the rook. Just to show that the skin, while on h6 it looks somewhat normal, we're defending the weakness, but it can be quite misplaced here. Black continues shuffling their rook for no reason. And here we finally play the move pawn f5. Like now we're really ready to target this weakness. Here black plays the move rook b6. Now do we take on h5? Of course not. If we take on h5 here, black gets to trade. And here after they take on b4, they've really managed to soften up our queenside pawns. And they've gained a lot of activity, so there's no real reason to allow for this. We can first overprotect this pawn. The rook goes to b4. And here we play the move bishop h5. The bishop drops back. And here Botvinnik plays a really high-class move rook h4. Very simply, we're trying to double up on the g-file, which will apply a lot of pressure to the black king. And also, we're sort of protecting against black going b5, which, like I said, is always a move you need to keep in mind. Because if we just, like, trade everything here, black here gains a lot of activity. And as you see here, they immediately equalize. But instead, after b5, we don't have to address this. We can play the move rook g4. And it doesn't really matter which way black takes. After the move rook g3, here black has a lot of problems, namely with this bishop. It can't really go anywhere. And if it goes to f7, we can take. Now, we don't give the check on g7, which allows the king to escape. But here the move rook g8 simply wins the game. And here we see another benefit of the pawn on f5. Well, at first, it only looks like we're cutting off the rook's defense of this pawn. The move pawn f5 also indirectly controls this king somewhat, which is just amazing. like that's a real multi-purpose move. So we don't see b5. Instead, we see the move pawn e6. I mean, black has to do something. But here we can just trade. And this really leaves the pawns in shambles. So from here on, the game is quite easily winning. I don't even think there's much more to analyze. I will go for the end of the game anyway. just so that you can see how it ended. But there's really not much more for black to do. Like, and here black decided to resign. That was the game Botvinnik versus Lombardy. Now, some takeaways for your games. If you want to play this Maroczy setup, first of all, patience really is key. You have some static advantages, so you just kind of want to slow play it and accumulate your advantages. You always want to be careful of the knight coming to g4 if d6 has been played, because if like you get some sort of scenario where this knight can come here, this can get really annoying. The pawn will very likely commit to f3 if there's a bishop standing on this long diagonal, but you don't want to be too quick with committing this pawn anywhere. The rooks belong on the files that are most likely to open up. That is very likely d1 and c1. And then Botvinnik saw that he could get some like static advantage and decided to go into an endgame. So despite the fact that you don't want to rush with trade in pieces since that somewhat negates your space advantage, you shouldn't be afraid of trades either. And finally, the light square bishop, despite being stuck behind these pawns, it plays against the two most common pawn breaks. Alright, like I said, these types of videos are new for me, so let me know what you think. If you think like, no, I don't really like you going through Grandmaster games and I prefer your normal videos, then just let me know. Alright, that would be all. Bye bye.